So I want to welcome to our stage, our virtual stage, Dr. Raphael Massiah. Dr. Massiah, the stage is yours, sir. Dr. Massiah, are you there?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. Good morning, everyone. And it is a great joy that we could continue this very important tradition. I've been tasked today, I've been tasked today to share on the theme leading in turbulent times. Um, I'm standing on the shoulders of those who presented yesterday, and I understand that yesterday was a very powerful time in God's presence and in the presence of each other. So, how do we deal with turbulence? Well, one of the first things I did is attempt to wrap my head around um, leading. I assume that we understand the whole notion of leadership, and in order for us to grapple the meaning of turbulence, I went to the dictionary that defines turbulence as chaotic, disordered, characterized by conflict, a time of war is a turbulent time for a country. If your family moves and your parents get divorced, you might call that a turbulent period in your history. What this definition has done is presented us with a threefold view of the notion of turbulent. So when we talk about leading in turbulent times, we are trying to grapple with these notions. One is universal, that is the chaotic, disordered, characterized by conflict. We live in a time where the turbulence, the spearhead of the turbulence is the COVID-19 pandemic. It is universal. No nation has been excused or exempt from this. It has produced a number of difficulties and challenges. So turbulence is not restricted to one geographical location, neither is it affected by social status or class. Turbulence, this chaos and the lack of order or absence of order, which we see in very many very powerful states around the world. Who could believe the nightly riots and or protestations that we're witnessing in perhaps the most developed nation in the world? And so that is an example of turbulence. An example of turbulence is as we go into winter, we are witnessing not panic, full scale panic, but we are witnessing uh, chaos as Europe is attempting, Western Europe is attempting to deal with its whole pandemic and the second or third wave. This definition from vocabulary.com describes turbulence or defines turbulence not only as something universal, but also national, like a war. Um, the wars between Syria and their surrogates, and Turkey and Armenia, and it's all across the world. We are witnessing what's taking place in Nigeria and what's taking place in other parts of the world. So turbulent is not restricted to a continent, it's not restricted to a country, it's not affecting only a people, but it's affecting the people of the world. This definition moves from universal to national to familial. That is the local setting, the basic, the sociologists will tell us the basic unit of society is the family. And families experience turbulence when they, for example, break up, they get divorced. So this is just one of the realities that we face in a world dealing with turbulence. I would like to, as we talk about giving leading in turbulent times, these are some features of what happens to nations, what happens to people. And that's the reason why we are hosting a webinar like this. So at least we can, before going to the solution, we can have an understanding of how widespread, of how challenging, and how it affects almost everyone. Workers during turbulent times, workers, families fear losing their jobs. You can't help when you look at the news around the world, you can't help but observing these challenges that we have. Workers around the world are experiencing these difficulties. There's a great degree of fear. The pandemic has produced fear, but that's not the only thing that has produced fear. The turbulent times um, produce this kind of fear. Managers fear a loss of productivity and profits. So it's not just the workers. And I'm going to present a case study momentarily for us to grapple and to observe that this issue, even though it's a new issue in the sense that the 21st century world is faced with a pandemic, the whole issue of turbulence is as old as the world. Investors and owners fear a loss of capital. Once there is turbulence, ladies and gentlemen, it's not one segment of people who go through these kinds of um, difficulties and challenges. Investors and owners, and of course, the ordinary people fear losing their lives. A German general um, from Prussia in those days, like he described Karl von Clausewitz, he advocates the need for the development and execution of a grand strategy de- dealing with the turbulence, dealing with turbulence times. This military czar said there needs to be development and the execution of a grand strategy. He defined strategy. He said strategy is the necessary response to the inescapable reality of limited resources. He had the foresight to recognize that the largest country, the most technologically savvy country or company or church, there's a reality, inescapable reality, he says, of limited resources. No entity, regardless of size, no entity, regardless of size, has unlimited resources. And this, as leaders, we need to really allow this to sink in. Strategy, therefore, is about making choices on how we will concentrate our limited resources to achieve competitive advance or advantage in an increasingly changing world. I'd like to repeat this. Strategy, therefore, as we think about leading in turbulent times, is about making choices on how we will concentrate our limited resources to achieve competitive advantage in an increasingly changing world. I decided that in this webinar, I found a time-tested case study that I'd like us to examine. It is found in the book of Exodus 5, 6 to 9. In this portion, we have a description of a national problem at the time. The Hebrews had been in captivity in Egypt for almost or around 430 years. Think about that. And something arose. The spiritual leader of this group came to the political leader of this is a spiritual leader of the Hebrews, came to the political leader of the Egyptian, which was the leading nation in the world. And the demands this spiritual leader made through the entire country, or if it didn't through the entire country, it revealed the unsettling issues that were just beneath the surface in that society. Moses, this leader, came with a very strange request, and I'd like you to read this case study, read the account for yourself. I've just taken an excerpt and presented it here. And Moses came with a request to the Pharaoh that the people, the slaves, the workers, the people who did the menial task, the people who made government runs, should be given time off for 3 days. No, there were no trade unions at that time. Pharaoh, to do what? To go into the desert to worship their God. Pharaoh was livid. And I've made an observation here, and he was not only livid, he said, I don't know your God, which is a reality in our 21st century world. And not only not knowing his God, he objected to this assertion that his free labor would be given time off. Who was going to do the dirty work? The wheels of production were going to grind to a halt. And I want to make this observation that during turbulent times, fear is an active ingredient, as is evident in our 21st century response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Whether it be universal, national, whether it's in your corporation or where you work, whether it's in your family business, this fear during turbulent times, fear is a creature that is present in every frame. Now, in order for us to deeper understand and analyze this case study, and later on apply the principles and an understanding of what we're talking about, it's necessary that we go in this direction as we deal with the whole question of leading in turbulent times. I'm going to put the spotlight on 3 groups. Pharaoh, he was a harsh taskmaster. He feared the rapid multiplication of the Hebrews in chapter 1, 10 to 12. We have an account where they were concerned with the rapid increase, population increase of the people who were slaves, the people who were servants. And while they seemingly were in control, fear was already manifesting in the heart of the political directorate. And after Moses came with this, the leader, the spiritual leader of the Hebrews, Pharaoh responded by making a demand of an unconscionable demand, some might want to say, of an increased output while removing the supply of basic resources or extension of deadlines. You remember the earlier quote I made about the whole question of having to function with scarce resources. So Pharaoh was aware of scarce resources, and he was aware of the cost of procuring. They were making bricks, they were building these fantastic cities that sometimes those of us who travel get an opportunity to see the wonders of architectural antiquity. Um, and Pharaoh said, you know what? He understood that the supplies were scarce, and therefore he removed the responsibility from his government and he placed it on the workers, the producers, and their managers. You will not only have to meet the same production deadlines, but I'm not going to provide straw. You have to gather that. You guys are a bunch of idle people. You want to go and spend 3 days pursuing some god in the desert. The spotlight forces on the pharaoh and some of his demands, and we look at the pharaoh and we are trying to analyze his actions. As we lead in turbulent times, we can learn, because one of the recommendation made is that we should do reflective thinking, reflective leadership. The Israelites, especially their supervisors. So even though they were in slavery, um, one of the methods used by oppressors is to divide those who they are manipulating and controlling, divide them in order to achieve control. And in turbulent times, this increases the oppression because you're not oppressed by foreigners, quote unquote foreigners. The instrument, the face of oppression uh, is really your own. And so the Israelites, especially their supervisors, responded to Pharaoh's new production policy by verbally attacking their own spiritual leader. In turbulent times, whether it be a factory, a pharmacy, whether it be an office, it's an international organization, once things become uncontrollable, people turn around and they have a tendency of becoming cannibalistic. And so they attack their own leader, Moses. Moses responded by turning on God. So it's really, you're seeing a domino effect here. In turbulent times, not only people behave strangely, but some of your best workers, some of your most productive leaders, they also have the ability of cracking under the pressure. So Moses responded by turning on God, and he challenged God and he challenged God's purposes. And to the point where Moses now was trying to disqualify himself um, by saying he was the wrong man for this job. That's what pressure does. That's what happens to leaders when times are not normal. And ladies and gentlemen, whether you are a leader in the church, a leader in the marketplace, a leader in the military, a leader in the civil, the police, a leader in the magistracy, in the judiciary, a leader in the legislature, a leader in the executive of your country, wherever you are, you're a leader in an international organization. I am positing that what is needed, I'm going to give you some recommendations momentarily because of the time, but what is needed, what is critical for us at this point in time is to understand that distortion takes place. Distortions of reality take place whenever you have turbulent times. I made a note in turbulent times, fear distorted reality for all three parties. And it was true uh, of those leaders then. And I humbly submit that it is true of leadership in turbulent times in our 21st century world. Now, we just have half an hour to make this presentation. And so I would like to use the remaining time to deal with some possible solutions. The case study was to bring us to a point to begin to understand that turbulent times can happen, not just only universally, it can happen within a nation, it can happen within a family. Now, how do we resolve these matters? How should we approach these matters? I think I have 14 or 15 recommendations to make. One, clearly identify the elements and characteristics of the turbulent times. These things are posted in the PowerPoint, so you can follow as I go through. We must clearly identify the elements and characteristics of the turbulent times. Um, in the case study, Pharaoh had a different description from the description of the Hebrews and also of Moses. We must be able to clearly understand and identify the elements. Secondly, distinguish the difference between reality and falsity. We are living in a 21st century world. It's amazing that people are finding it uh, well uh, quixotic, I would say. They're not. They are. They're laughing. There are some leaders, world leaders, when they speak. Institutions have developed around the world. And you know what is the objective of these institutions? To point out the number of falsity in the, in leaders' presentations. And they're saying, okay, he spoke for 20 minutes, he spoke for half an hour, she spoke for 1 hour, and this presentation was riddled with inconsistencies and with falsities and with these kinds of things. There was a time when leadership, when those in leadership who stood at the podium prided themselves with communicating truth and not falsity. Now you have the development of a whole new system to attempt to tell the difference. So in if this happens in normal times, in turbulent times, it's going to get worse. And I can hear some of you saying, that is perhaps only is only manifested in the marketplace. I beg to disagree. That is happening even within the hallowed chambers of the church. Yeah, a lot of difference between reality and falsity. Thirdly, know what you are fighting before you begin to fight. It is a critical um, thing for us to understand this. Um, I think I got this idea from Clausewitz. You must know what you are fighting before you begin to fight. If you don't know what you're fighting, you might end up turning your weapons of aggression, and the people around you could die from friendly fire. So you must know in turbulent times, things can become so distorted. I said things, but people may appear to be distorted also. Is that possible? People die from friendly fire. Factor in your decision mix, the fourth observation or recommendation. You and I must factor into your decision mix or our decision mix these issues. Don't only look at economic and political. we must also add social and spiritual issues. The slavery thing was doing well in the case study that we looked at. And then a spiritual leader came and made a request that turned everything on its head. I've always looked at that case and I wonder um, how those things can happen. There are people who ignored this sphere. They only focus, and especially universities and when folks go to developmental schools, they focus on the political, the social, and the economic. Spiritual issues can create major distortions and add to the turbulence. You ask the French. A teacher recently, over the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, was conducting a class and he was pointing out this whole notion of something that they cherish, liberty and freedom. And he made certain observation. A young man offended by what he heard this teacher said, traveled 50 kilometers, and the end is in our news. That was not political or economic or social. That's the point I'm making. We have to consider spiritual issues also. Devise and implement training whose core make them easily adaptable to changing scenarios. The world is changing at a rapid rate. And whereas in antiquity, like somewhere around when Moses wrote Exodus 1440 BC, you could imagine the world has changed. Those people found it difficult. Their technology would not allow a quick turnover in their response to the new demand from this oppressive Pharaoh. We are living in the 21st century, and we are seeing how um, countries are finding their own niche. Um, Companies are finding their own niche, and what is termed as being oppressive by one, some other one is moving forward and advancing. Is they're providing leadership, and so this recommendation, the sixth recommendation, is concentrate resources, which are always limited on critical elements. You know, we operate as though that we have all the time in the world, and therefore this is affecting very many. Lots of companies are lagging behind. Um, Neocolonialism um, is rising again in our world, and the countries at the center are seeking to create a new hegemony over the countries at the periphery, and they're using new methods to do so, whether it's financial, technological, or just brute force. And they are bringing this kind of control. We must understand, we must concentrate resources, and we must remember that resources are always limited. The seventh recommendation, be ready to innovate. Uh, this webinar, the trust of it is to ensure that we could challenge the minds of young people. Um, you know, well, I'll probably make mention of this at 10, but be ready to innovate. Clearly, the Hebrews were not ready to innovate. Be flexible, commit to constant learning, unlearning, and relearning. Uh, this word, I could have just said, be flexible, but leading in turbulent times requires flexibility that would commit leaders to constant learning, learning new technologies, unlearning old habits. They are leaders who celebrate things that are obsolete. I mean, it's obsolete and they are celebrating it. And no wonder they are not communicating. They're losing market size. They're losing market influence. So we have to learn and unlearn and relearn quickly. Practice self-control in turbulent times. When times are normal, we know that the greatest and the highest form of any kind of government is self-government. Discover your anchor. And you probably can have several PhDs behind your name. The question I would ask you in turbulent times, who is your anchor? You know, when Pharaoh put the pressure down on the Hebrews and the Hebrews put the pressure down on Moses, Moses went to his anchor. And I am submitting to you in our 21st century world, we cannot negotiate successfully the world that we have before us, except we identify unashamedly our anchor and our commitment. Let me see if I can give you in the 8 seconds more that I have. Communicate openly and honestly. Ladies and gentlemen, don't buckle under pressure. Practice reflective leadership. You are not the first leader in to ever to experience um, turbulent times. Therefore, do the research, and you notice how far I took you back, 1440 BC, to look at the case study. And even though we are examining in this webinar in 2020 this topic of turbulent times, the times have changed, but those undergirding principles, they remain the same. So if we could study how those leaders made it through then, we will have uh, a platform to move on. Develop the skill of negotiation, and finally, always trust God. Always put your trust in Him. This is quite a privilege to have spent these 30 minutes with you, setting your day. And I pray that for the rest of the day, as we remain in this webinar, our whole lives and our minds will be impacted by these wonderful truths that we'll hear. God bless you. Thank you for being a part of GFL 2020.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Massiah. I appreciate your insight and taking us all the way back to Pharaoh. You know, I think that was a very prominent and a good explanation of how to lead in turbulent times. You know, experiencing the lack of resources that they had went through for those many years and how they managed that. I think it's relevant to even now, right? We're going through these economic downturns in a lot of our countries, a lot of these changing in political views and the powers that be in the many countries and the, the the pushback that they're receiving from citizens and civic leaders and all of that. So dealing with uh, the challenges as leaders in these types of times, I think just reviewing history, like you said, and going back and learning from those experiences and those circumstances and the stuff that they use to develop themselves into better countries, better individuals, better leaders. I think it's super relevant. We have a few more minutes. I wanted to ask you just one or two questions.
For
In
sure.
particular, with your excuse me, with your particular topic in leading in turbulent times. We asked this question in our panel last night, and I'll ask the same question to you. What type of leaders do you think are necessary? type of character that those leaders, or characteristics, I should say, that those leaders need to efficiently lead in turbulent times? What are those characteristics?
Well, the characteristics that leaders need to lead in turbulent times, they must not be shifty in terms of their belief system, because when things are normal, they are folk who you're leading and they are solidly supporting you. When things become turbulent, those same people can turn on you, and they can attack you from every center, because bear in mind they are also affected by the whatever is happening in the wider society. So the leader has got to be very firm. Look how it affected Moses, a solid man. He went to God and said, "You know what? I am not qualified to do this job." Um, and there are lots of folks who are disqualifying themselves because of the pressure. I think one in one of the solutions I said, we must have an anchor. We must have a relationship. And I think the historical analysis is very important for us to examine what happened in the past. And so we can benefit knowing that Moses considered the spiritual issue. And in that same case study, we saw where God reiterated, I got this, Moses, I got this, I got you, and I got this. I'm going to deliver you from out of this situation. And as business people, as leaders, right across the spectrum of the world, there is someone who's bigger than all of the issues and all the problems. And if we have a relationship with him, we'll be able to make it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you, Dr. Massiah, for your words of wisdom. Thank you for walking us through this process of becoming resilient leaders, or being resilient leaders, especially during turbulent times. You're a resilient leader yourself, and I know you've had many turbulent times in your days, and you've been able to weather the storm. And we hope to keep leaning on your wisdom, sir. So thank you so much for being a part of opening us up this morning and being a part of the sessions for today.
You're welcome.
All right.